Hello and welcome to another episode of Transport in Africa, a weekly podcast dedicated to spotlight cutting-edge research, innovation, and ideas shaping transport systems across Africa. I am your host, Polycarp Chebe. In each episode, we sit down with a researcher, practitioner, or change maker who is redefining how mobility works in Africa. In today's episode, we are diving into one of the most important issues shaping urban mobility, public transport integration in Africa. When public transport systems are well integrated, they make travel easier and more efficient. They can reduce travel time and inconveniences, improve accessibility, and make public transport a more attractive alternative to private car use. This is particularly important for African cities, which are experiencing rapid population growth and urban expansion. While many cities have multiple transport modes, such as buses, minibuses, motorcycle taxis, and rail systems, these services often operate in fragmented ways. As a result, passengers frequently face challenges such as inefficient transfers, uncoordinated routes, congestion, and long travel time, all of which make everyday mobility more difficult. In today's episode of Transport in Africa, we will explore what public transport integration really means, why it matters for African cities, and how governments and stakeholders can begin moving towards more coordinated and efficient transport systems. To help us unpack this important issue, I am delighted to welcome Dr. Samuel Ajayi, a researcher and practitioner in transport planning. Hello, Dr. Samuel. Welcome back to the show. It's always a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be part of this conversation.
Before we get into the conversation proper, can you once more remind our listeners by telling us a bit about your personal and research background?
Yeah, thank you very much once again. My name is Dr. Samuel Ajayi. I'm a transport engineer and researcher with a strong interest in sustainable urban transport, mobility, transport system analysis, and intelligent transport systems. I currently serve as a principal research fellow at the Nigerian Building and Road Research Institute in Lagos, Nigeria, where I work on transport-related research aimed at addressing some of the pressing mobilities and infrastructure challenges faced by cities and regions in Nigeria and across sub-Saharan Africa. A major part of my work also focuses on understanding the relationship between transport and wider development outcomes. For instance, transport systems do not really influence congestion and travel time. They also affect public health, productivity, access to opportunity, social equity, climate outcomes, and the competitiveness of cities. So I've also contributed to the policy support and strategic planning process, where the goal is not only to generate academic knowledge, but also to ensure that such knowledge informs actual decision making. This is something I care about, bridging the gap between the research and implementation.
Very much, Dr. Samuel, for that brief background. For our listeners who are not familiar with this issue, when we talk about public transport integration, what exactly does that mean in practice, and why is it important for African cities?
Thank you very much. The public transport integration, in practical terms, refers to the process of ensuring that the different elements of the city transport system function as one coordinated networks rather than a disconnected or competing service. In many cities today, a passenger may need to use more than one mode to complete a single journey. So, for example, someone may walk from home to the bus stops and take a feeder bus and then connect to a BRT corridor and then perhaps use another local service to reach their final destination. So if each of these stages is poorly connected, the journey becomes very stressful, costly, and unpredictable, and time consuming. So, but if the system is integrated, the journey becomes smoother, more reliable, and more efficient. So, in essence, transport integration is about making travel seamless. And there are several dimensions to it. So the first is the physical integration, which means the infrastructure is designed to make movements between modes very easy. For example, the bus stops should be close to the rail station. Interchange terminals should be well organized. Pedestrian access should be safe and direct. And also passengers should not have to walk long, unsafe distances to travel from one service to another. That's the physical integration. The second one is the operational integration. This means the routes, the schedules, the service frequencies, and the network structure are well coordinated. That is, instead of the several operators duplicating the same route, while other important areas remain undeserved. Services are planned to complement one another. Truck, route, feeder services, last mile services, and non-motorized transport should all work together. Those are the operational integration. The third one is the fare integration, the FARE, the fare integration. A passenger should ideally not need to negotiate or pay separately at every stage of the journey. So we should have a unified ticketing and payment system, which can make travel more efficient and convenient, and also more affordable. So the fourth aspect is the information integration, where passengers need clear and accessible information about routes, schedules, stops, fares, and transfers options. So this sometimes is often overlooked, but it's very essential, especially for first-time users, for the elderly, the older adult, the visitors, and people unfamiliar with the particular route. And the fifth one, which is the last one, is the institutional integration, which may be the most critical of all, because it means that the agencies responsible for transport planning, infrastructure, regulation, enforcement, and service delivery are coordinated under a common vision. So without this, the other dimension of the integration are much more harder to achieve. So this is very important for African cities, because many African cities are currently characterized by rapid growth, limited infrastructural capacity, we have the fragmented institutional arrangement, and also this heavy dependence on the informal public transports. So this condition must make mobility challenging for millions of people every day. So in most cities, passengers face long, uncertain journeys, multiple coordinated transfers, inconstant parking or pricing, poor waiting environment, weak pedestrian access, and also a general lack of system coherence. I can say that the public transport integration is therefore very important, because it helps city moves from the fragmented mobility to planned, to the efficient, to the inclusive and resilient urban transport systems, which improves accessibility, supports social inclusion, reduce congestion pressure, and can also contribute to lower emissions when it can encourage people to shift from the private vehicles to the shared public transport. So I can say in practical terms, integration is not just a luxury, it's necessary foundation for our sustainable urban mobility in Africa.
Thank you very much for shedding light on what transport integration means, which involves both physical, operational, fare, and institutional integration. Dr. Samuel, when we look across African cities, we observe that many cities already have different public transport modes like buses, minibuses, motorcycles, tricycles, and even light rail systems. My question is, from your perspective, what are the biggest barriers to integrating public transport systems in African cities, even though many cities already have multiple transport modes?
Yeah, that's a very important question, because the presence of multiple transport modes does not automatically translate into integrated transport systems. Yeah, you can have multiple transport modes, but are not really integrated. Many African cities have what we might call the modal diversity without system integration. So in other words, there are many services, but they do not function as a coherent network. That's the reason for this integration. The reason for this are quite deep and sometimes often structural. So the first barrier I've seen is the institutional fragmentation. In many cities, different aspects of the transport are handled by different ministries, agencies, local government authorities, often with overlapping responsibilities and limited coordination. So one agency may be in charge of roads, another of public transport regulation, another of traffic management, and yet another of urban planning. So when planning and governance are fragmented in this way, integration becomes difficult because there is no single body with the authority and the capacity to coordinate the whole system. And the second major barrier is the dominance of these informal transport services. Across many African cities, we have these informal systems such as the minibus, the motorcycles. In Ghana, we have trotro, their dominance shared taxis. They are part of the backbone of the urban mobility. Why? Because they provide service, vital service, especially where the informal public transport is weak or absent. So, however, though they operate through highly decentralized arrangements with flexible routing, cash-based fare collection, and varying service standards. So an intense competition for passengers. So these characteristics makes them adaptable and resilient. But they also make formal system integration more complex. So that is we have the dominance of this informal transport. The third one, barrier I see, is the weak long-term transport planning. So in many cases, cities have grown faster than their mobility system have been planned for. Okay, so transport investments often happen in a project-by-project manner, rather than through a comprehensive citywide mobility strategies. So without a clear integrated network plan that aligns land use, mobility demand, modal roads and infrastructure development. So what emerges is a patchwork of intervention rather than just a coordinated transport systems. So another important challenge is the limited data or weak transport intelligence systems. So integrated planning requires evidence-based data. Cities need reliable data on passengers' demand, origin, destination patterns, vehicles flows, route performance, transfer patterns, travel times, safety issues, fare structures, and user experience. So in many African contexts, such data are very scarce or insufficient or outdated or fragmented. So without good data, planning tends to be reactive rather than strategic. There are also the issue of infrastructure inadequacy. Of course, integration requires the physical space for transfer and coordination. So this includes terminals, interchange, the bus bays, pedestrian pathways or walkways, the cycling access. We have the signage systems, the waiting areas, and the passenger information points. So many cities lack such, or they are poorly designed. Financial constraint is also another barrier, financial, because integration requires significant investments, not only in the infrastructure, but also in the technology. Because institutional reforms, the service contracting and enforcement system and capacity building. So they also, not only we have significant investment in the institutional reform, service contracting, enforcement system and capacity building. So many cities face competing fiscal pressure, which can slow down the transport reforms. Finally, there's a broader challenge of urban form and unplanned development. Like I said, in many African cities, low density sprawl, informal settlement, and uneven land use patterns make it difficult to structure efficient, integrated transport corridors and networks. So the barriers are not only technical, they are institutional, economical, political, spatial, and social. That's why transport integration requires more than infrastructure alone. It requires reforms, coordination, data engagement, and long-term commitment.
Dr. Samuel, there is a growing interest in bus rapid transit, what we call BRT, across many African cities today, with most of these cities implementing these BRT systems. My question is, how can BRT be better integrated with existing transport modes?
Yeah, thank you very much. BRT has significant potential in African cities because it offers a relative cost-effective way to provide higher capacity and more reliable mass transit compared to the conventional mixed traffic bus operation. So a BRT corridor on its own is not enough. Its value depends on how well it is embedded within the wider urban mobility network. So for BRT to properly integrated, cities need to think of it not as a standalone project, but as a spine or like a backbone of a larger multimodal system. So the first major requirement for me is the integration of the feeder services, that most passengers do not live directly on the BRT corridor, so they need safe and avoidable ways to access the system. So local bus, organized minibus services, neighborhood shuttles, the cycling access and the walkable streets can all serve as feeders. So without strong feeder connectivity, the BRT system may serve as only as a narrow strip of the city and fail to deliver its full potential or benefits. So secondly, to me, there must be well-designed interchange and transfer facilities for BRT stations. Stations should connect efficiently with other modes, including our conventional buses, rail where available, ferries in waterfront cities, taxis, and non-motorized transports. So these transfer points must be safe, clearly organized, and user-friendly. So a passenger should not need to navigate chaos just to continue a journey. So the third one is the fare and the payment integration, which I explained earlier, very essential. One of the frustration passengers often face in a fragmented system is paying multiple times through separate uncoordinated cash transactions. So BRT integration improves significantly when passengers can use a common payment platform across different modes, the same one. So this reduces frictions and supports network and thinking rather than this mode by mode travel. So the fourthly, I can say cities must improve this last mile connectivity. This includes pedestrian infrastructure, cycling access, street lighting, crossings. We have the crossings, we have the sidewalks, local access road and local access road. So a BRT system may be efficient in movement along the corridor, but if the first and the last segment of the journey are unsafe or inconvenient, many users will still struggle to access it. Very important. So the fifth one, the BRT should be integrated into the land use pattern and the urban development planning. Stations often become important urban nodes. So if planned well, they can support the transit-oriented development, reduce car dependence, and improve access to jobs, services, and shape our more urban growth. So sixth, for me, I can say integration also requires engagement with existing operators, especially in cities where minibus and paratransit systems service dominates. So rather than treating them purely as competitors to be removed, cities can explore structured transition pathways where some of the services become feeders. Some operators become part of the new formal operating arrangement, and livelihood are considered within the reform process. We can also learn from global examples, systems like Bogota. So Africa must adapt such lessons from global examples carefully to local realities, especially around informality. So the central point is this now: BRT works best when it is planned as part of a network, not as an isolated infrastructure project. Its success depends on not only on the buses and the lane, but also on the connection, on the access, on the governance, and the payment system, and the passenger experience, which is very important. So we must design the cities for the people.
Thank you very much. Many cities in the world today, especially those of the global north and some in the global south, like you mentioned, have made substantial efforts towards public transport integration. Are there any African cities that are making efforts towards transport integration? And what lessons can we learn from such cities?
Yes, we have a number of African cities that are making very good progress, although the pace and the scale and the depth of integration differs from one city to another. So what's encouraging for me is that these cities show that movement towards integration is possible. So even in contexts marked by the rapid growth. So let me begin. For example, we have Lagos, Nigeria. Lagos, which is one of the most important examples in African context. Lagos is a megacity which intense travel demands and complex mobility challenges. Over the years, the establishment of the LAMATA, the Lagos Metropolitan Area Transport Authority, has provided a more coordinated institutional framework for transport planning and reforms. So this is very important because it demonstrates the importance of having a central body that can think beyond individual projects and work towards a more integrated metropolitan transport system. The key lesson from Lagos is that institutional leadership matters. And that integration is often a phased journey rather than an overnight transformation. So another example I saw is the Johannesburg, South Africa. So they have this Rail via BRT system. The city attempted to restructure part of the urban transport landscape and bring former mass transit into greater prominence. So one of the most instructive aspects of the Johannesburg experience, the engagement with existing minibus taxi operators who are the major players in the city mobility economy. Integration must involve not only infrastructure and service design, but also stakeholder transition, negotiation, and political management. We also have the Cape Town. Cape Town is also what's highlighting in South Africa, the My City Bus has shown how cities can combine dedicated infrastructure, route planning, and modern stations and digital elements or tools in a more structured way. So Cape Town's experience underscores the value of service quality, branding, infrastructure discipline, and network design. We also have Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. So they also provide another important case through its BRT development too. The city has shown how dedicated bus corridors and high-capacity service can begin to reshape travel patterns in a very congested urban environment. So Dar es Salaam demonstrate the value of increment capacity upgrading and corridor-based reforms in cities where travel demand is very high and road congestion is severe. And we also have Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. Okay, they have this light rail system that represents the major steps in introducing the urban rail-based mobility into African city context. So we have that in Addis Ababa. They illustrate the importance of diversifying urban transport options and building systems that can handle high passengers volumes. We also have Nairobi, Kenya, and that city which to watch for. Although the transport integration journey is still evolving, like I said, for most African cities, at least they have made efforts around the BRT planning, commuters, rail improvements, and wider transport reforms, which indicates the recognition of the need for a more structured multimodal network. So Nairobi case shows that even when the full implementation is still emerging, policy direction and decision intent are very important as the early steps. Also have Kigali, Rwanda. They have also pursued improvements in the public transport organization. Kigali is often cited in discussions around urban management and governance. So Kigali have done some. Also beyond this, we also have some lessons from the North Africans, as well as including tram and bus coordinations in Casablanca, in Morocco, also in Cairo, where they have invested more in rail-based urban transit and bus systems, reflect the importance of this multimodal thinking in large metropolitan regions.
Earlier, you mentioned different forms of transport integration, including physical, operational, fares, institutional, among others. Which of these do you think African cities at the moment should prioritize as far as transport integration is concerned?
Yeah, thank you very much for that very important question. I would say that the starting point should be institutional integration, followed closely by the physical integration. The reason is quite straightforward. If the institutions are not coordinated, it becomes very difficult to coordinate the services, the fares, the infrastructure, and the overall passenger experience. The city may invest in buses, terminals, and even rail systems, but if planning, regulation, enforcement, and service delivery are still fragmented across multiple bodies without a shared strategy, the system will just struggle to function coherently. In many successful global examples that we have seen, there are usually a strong metropolitan transport authority or coordinating body that oversees the network design, the modal coordination, and the service standards and strategic mobility planning. In African context, this is important because cities often have a mix of formal and informal operators. We have multiple jurisdictions, we have overlapping planning responsibilities. Without a coordinating institutional framework, each mode or operator tends to optimize for itself rather than just for a system as a whole. So once the governance foundation is in place, the next priority should be physical integration. Passenger experience transport as a physical journey. So if an interchange points are confusing, unsafe, or they are distant, they are congested or poorly designed, the travel experience remains fragmented even if planning documents says the system is integrated. So physical integration means creating an environment that makes the transfer practical, and dignified. It includes the multimodal terminals, safe walkways, universal access for persons with disabilities, the weather protection, clear signage, organized boarding points, and well-located feeder connections. So after the institution and the physical integration, cities can now push further for operational integration. Would this involve rationalizing routes, aligning schedules, reducing unnecessary service duplication, and structuring system so that the trunk and the feeder service work together efficiently? Then comes after is the fare integration, which is also very extremely important for users, convenience, and affordability. When it is introduced into a system that already has some governance structure and operational clarity. So all the dimension matters. So from a sequencing perspective, I will argue that African cities should begin with the structures that make the rest possible. That is governance first, passenger-oriented infrastructure second, service coordination third, and the unified payment system as part of the system maturation. So that said, this does not mean that cities must wait to complete one before touching the next. No, in practice, these can evolve together. But in terms of strategic emphasis, institutional coordination should be at the center.
Looking ahead, what immediate and practical actions can African governments and other stakeholders take to support more public transport integration in Africa?
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, this is a very good question because while the discussion about the transport integration can sometimes remain at the conceptual level, what cities truly need are the practicable and the implementable action that can begin to transform urban mobility systems into the short to medium terms. To me, there are several strategies that African governments, metropolitan authorities, and transport stakeholders can begin to implement. Number one, they need to develop the comprehensive integrated urban mobility plans. They call it SUMPS, the SUMPS, the comprehensive integrated urban mobility plans, or citywide transport master plan that clearly define how different transport modes will function together as a part of a single coordinated system. We need an integrated mobility plans that help us to align public transport developments, land use patterns of planning, infrastructure investment, and non-motorized transport networks and traffic management strategies into unified vision. Secondly, government should also prioritize institutional reform, like I said, and coordination. Thirdly, the cities should also invest in transport data systems and digital mobility platforms, because reliable data is essential for effective transport planning and management. So we can invest in technology such as the automated passenger counting systems. We also have the GPS-based vehicle tracking. We have the mobility data platforms and digital ticketing systems. So this technology will allow planners to understand travel demand patterns, to identify service gaps and monitor system performance and improve our operators' efficiency. So fourthly, we also need to invest in multimodal transport infrastructure, like I said. Investment requires physical space where passenger can move smoothly between different transport modes. Cities will prioritize the development of transport terminals, interchange stations, and multimodal hubs, park and ride facilities, and safe pedestrian access routes. And fifth, government should also adopt strategies for gradual formalization and integration of integration of the informal public transport. Like I said, we have the minibus that dominate most of the African cities. So attempts to eliminate them entirely is not really realistic or socially destructive. So instead of eliminating them, policymakers should focus on structured approaches to integrate this service into the broader transport system through the route rationalization and operators cooperative service contracts, maybe regulatory reforms and training program. So we actually allow the informal transport to evolve into a more organized and reliable component of the urban mobility system. Sixth, African cities should promote non-motorized transport integration, including walking and cycling infrastructure. Many public transport journeys begins and end with walking. Yes, yet pedestrian infrastructure is still inadequate, missing, or unsafe in most African cities. So we should invest in the sidewalks, pedestrian crossing, cycling lanes, and safe street designs, which can improve the first mile and the last mile connectivity to public transport systems. And the stakeholder engagement and public communication should be critical. Transport reforms can affect operators, commuters, businesses, and communities. So government should ensure that education initiative involve consultation with the transport unions, operators, the civil society, the local communities, so there will be transparent communication which can help to build trust and reduce resistance to the reforms. So I can say in summary, we need to strengthen this transport integration in African cities because it requires a multi-dimensional approach which combines the institutional reforms with the infrastructural reforms, technological innovation, stakeholder engagement, and the long-term strategic planning. But the good news is that many of the solutions required are already known. But what is needed now is a strong political commitment from the government. We also need a coordinated governance and sustained investment in this integrated urban mobility system.
Yeah, thank you very much. Doctor, before we wrap up this conversation, is there anything else you would like to share or a final message about public transport integration in Africa?
Yeah, thank you very much. For me, I think the public transport integration should be seen as a strategic development priorities, not just the transport sector technical exercise. So the future of African cities will depend heavily on how well they manage mobility. So if mobility remains fragmented, inefficient, unsafe, and unavoidable, then cities will struggle with congestion, pollution, exclusion, productivity loss, and weakened resilience. But if the city move forward towards integrated transport system, the benefit will be transformative. So integrated transport improves more than movement. It improves access. It connects people to jobs, to schools, to healthcare, market, and social opportunities. So it supports economic reforms, efficiency by reducing wasted travel time and improving urban productivity. So it supports social equity by making mobility more affordable and predictable for low-income households who really rely heavily on the public and the shared transport. It also supports environmental sustainability by creating the condition for greater public transport use. So I also believe Africa has a unique opportunity here because many cities are still in the stage of rapid transformation. So there's a room to avoid repeating some of the mistakes as we have seen elsewhere, particularly unchecked car-dependent urban growth. African cities can build more integrated, people-centered system, like I said, if policy choices are made early and intentional. We need to build policy for people-centered system. But this will require commitment, actually. It requires institutional reforms. It requires stakeholder collaboration. It requires better data, stable investment, and inclusive planning, and the courage to think long-term. So the good news is that the building blocks already exist in many places. We have the energetic cities, growing policy attention is now. We have the emerging technologies, local innovations, and increasing recognition that mobility must be more sustainable and inclusive. So the task now is to move from the fragmented service to connected systems, from isolated projects to integrated networks, from the short-term reaction to the long-term urban mobility strategy. So in my view, one of the most important transport transition Africa must pursue in the years ahead is the transport multimodal integration. Thank you very much.
Very much, Dr. Samuel. That brings us to the end of this episode of our podcast on transport in Africa. I am very grateful having you on board. Always interesting sharing insights on transport-related issues in Africa. I wish you all the best in your professional journey.
Thank you very much for having me.
If you enjoyed this episode or learned something new, please consider subscribing to our page. You can also contribute by sharing this podcast with friends and colleagues who are interested in transport and mobility issues in Africa. If you are a researcher or practitioner working on transport in Africa and would like to share your work on this platform, feel free to reach out to me at chebechesifu@campus.technion.ac.il and we can discuss how to feature your work on this show. Until next time, I am your host Polycarp Chebe. Thanks for listening and bye-bye.